I was thinking, can we now please switch to the Christus Victor
Yeah.
doctrine, and if we can expand on it, where do we see it in the Bible? Where do we see it in the councils, in the Apocrypha, in the church tradition, and things like that?
Yeah, we can definitely do that. I think the easiest kind of connectivity that we have into this idea, even just kind of saying like maybe there is this literal sense of like Jesus descending somewhere, right? Which is weird to even talk about Hades and being literal, because we're talking about like a spiritual place, right? But you have this passage where when Peter is talking about this, he says, seeing was what was to come, he spoke of the resurrection of the Messiah, and that he was not abandoned to the realm of the dead, nor did his body see decay. And the realm of the dead there is translated from Hades, right? So we have this direct connectivity into that. And he's actually quoting from Psalm 16:10, which uses Hades in the Septuagint, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, to translate Sheol from Hebrew, right? So we have this very kind of direct connectivity, I think, into this idea that, yes, Jesus did descend somewhere, that he was in the realm of the dead, that this is called Sheol or Hades, that this is referred to when we talk about the sign of Jonah being in 3 days in the heart of the earth, right? All of these are kind of packed in there. And that's one kind of side, I think, that helps us to say, okay, it seems like this is what was going on, that he was actually there. But then you ask the question of what was he doing, right? And the most direct connection there, I think, that gives a framework for it. So there are all these verses that you can kind of pick and you can say, it seems like this might be talking about this, but the most direct connection that we see, I think, especially in early church tradition, is to say, when we look at the Exodus and then we look at what Jesus accomplished, and like to us, they're the same thing, right? That Jesus was accomplishing an Exodus, but it's a more universal or greater Exodus than just from slavery in Egypt. It's actually an Exodus from death, and that this is something that Jesus did in descending into Hades and basically kicking down the doors, if you will, and freeing the righteous dead and bringing them up into the presence of God in spirit. So that's the idea. And then we can look at a number of other verses that kind of talk about things that are related to this, that have been understood in this way historically in the church.
Yeah, thank you for that. Does anyone else want to jump in with biblical examples so we can analyze them one by one, and then we can jump to another subtopic of where we can find this in Apocrypha or the tradition and stuff like that.
I mean, there's like a ton we can do with it. I want to hold back for a bit because I know that once I get started, I will start going on a rant here.
I've got a comment on this passage actually, since we just brought it up. So, this is not my expertise, but Calvin is very much indebted to Augustine, and Augustine has a huge problem with this passage. He gets to it and he really doesn't know what to do with it in one of his letters. If I remember correctly, and if anybody knows and needs to correct me, that's okay. He can figure out why Christ would be talking to spirits in Hades, but he doesn't know why it says Noah. And so he has to figure that out and kind of reshape it or say it's wrong in order to fit his framework, which for Calvin to repeat that later, it kind of makes sense if he's building off of what Augustine has done, centuries later, but it's the same sort of idea, right? But to me, it makes sense because this is sort of the gospel in the first place. The gospel was a victory message. The gospel existed even before Christ came, but we seem to have forgotten that. But if we put it in the context of victory, I think it starts to fall into place a little bit easier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I like to, I often think of gospel in a very broad sense, because you even have Paul in Galatians, I think it's in 3 or 4, talking about, God, preaching the gospel to Abraham. And it's like, okay, like, did he take him through the Romans road? Did we go through the 4 spiritual laws? What exactly does that mean? But I mean, Paul says it's like when he tells him, like, that through your seed all the earth is going to be, all the nations of the earth, all the families of the earth are going to be blessed, right? So there's something about the promises to Abraham that ties directly into the gospel in a way that is understood, that is bigger than just the way that we like to look at it here. And the victory, declaration of victory is like, that's what a gospel was in the first century, right? And even if we go back into Isaiah, we have the same terminology used to talk about, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news, right? What are they doing? They're bringing good news from the battle. What is the good news? You won, and it was the victory of your armies and your king and your God, right? And so this is all kind of tied up into what we understand, really, however we understand the herring of hell. However we understand the cross, right? We understand it as a victory, and we understand it as a proclamation of victory for these reasons.
I mean, even just thinking about the characters in the Bible and sort of what we expect, but maybe we haven't thought it through to the end. Like we would expect to see Abraham, Moses, David, Elisha. Obviously, Elijah is a different case. Maybe we'll get there. But Elisha, I would expect them to be redeemed, saved, resurrected at the end times. How does that happen if all they had to do is just Jesus Christ into their heart? Right? It doesn't really make sense.
Yeah. Something has to connect them into what Jesus was doing in his life, in his teaching, in his incarnation in the first place, in his death, in his resurrection, in his ascension. Like, something has to connect them into all of that in order for them to benefit from that. And how do you do that when they are in the place where they're held captive by death, right? And that's a place where I think we can tie into a couple of passages that speak to who Jesus is and what he accomplished, that do get a little more specific, right? So you have Hebrews 2:14 and 15. This is since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil. That's a key, right? And free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death, right? So whether we're talking living or dead, Jesus did something to free people from the fear of death and took the power of death from the devil, right? And we see the result of that. Then Jesus talking about this when he says, do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades, in Revelation 1:17 and 18, right? So something happened there where the devil had the power of death, and he doesn't anymore. And that happens in between Jesus' death on the cross and his resurrection, right? And that gives us, I think, a good biblical framework for saying, we know something happened here. We know part of what the result is. We can start to talk a little bit more about maybe how that actually happened, right?
Yeah, well, and all of this makes me think about how layered this whole conversation is. Because we have the Old Testament, we have the New Testament, we have today, we have our world, we have the spirit world, we have all of that that's going on, and then we have just physical creation itself. All of that is all wrapped up in what is going on in the work of Christ. And it's not like there's lesser times or, oh, that's, that was just delivery from slavery. Like, the Exodus was not just delivery from slavery. The Exodus was so much more than that. And so what we have to do is we have to take these pieces and not separate the pieces into different little compartments, like they don't belong together. But they can inform one another, and they can be on top of one another. Like in 1 Peter 3, is it 3:19, where it's talking about gosh, I just lost it. Where Christ went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison. Like, that's one of those things that people don't want to touch because they're not thinking in terms of what all of this means, what it means that Christ actually did something during this time, like, that actually mattered, right? That he wasn't just hanging out drinking Mai Tais on the beach or something. Like, he was
soul sleep.
yeah, right? He wasn't just, having a really long nap. So I think it's all, and no matter where you end up landing on the systematic theology side, where it's like, oh, Christ actually, this is the list of people he saved, or whatever. Like, there's something that happened here, like, and we can all agree on that, and yet if we're not talking about it, then we're not getting any further in the discussion.